All right, folks, can we hear me? Good, all right. So as Matt has said, my name is Andy Peterson. I'm coming to you from IBM. Am I still picked up? All right, good. And I'm going to talk to you about FinOps. So before I get into things today, I just want to take a quick poll to gauge where everyone is at in the audience. So first and foremost, can I get a hand if you have heard the term FinOps before and know what it's about? Oh, this is good then. I don't have to skip all of my slides. Secondly, the next piece that I want to address is how many folks here work with resources in the cloud today with the major cloud service providers, AWS, Azure, Google, Oracle. All right, well, this might bore some of you then, but we'll get into things. So first and foremost, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself. Maybe. We'll try. We'll see. And, there we go. All right. So just a little bit about me. I started at IBM in 2013 as a help desk agent, making $27,000 a year. So over the course of my career here, I've picked up that laundry list of certifications that are outlined in the lower left-hand corner of the screen. And I've moved through a variety of roles. In 2014, I started taking on some data analytics roles. Focused primarily around our help desk service metrics and identifying how we were performing across our enterprise and servicing our clients. And that's where my addiction to data began. So I knew nothing about Excel other than doing simple math calculations, and over the course of doing all of this data analytics, took on SQL development. I was briefly a database administrator and developed a real passion for data. So I'm one of those people who you can stick in a dark room with a million lines of data in a spreadsheet, and I'm happy. That's my Zen place. I love it. So I moved on through a couple of other roles, taking on various leadership positions, focusing on operations management, ultimately leading the day-to-day operations of our federal end user services organization at IBM. And then in 2022, I decided to take on a bit of a change. In the audience is my current manager, and I was speaking to him at his birthday party, and he said, I'm putting together this team that's working on some new products that we're hoping to integrate from one of our European acquisitions. So I said, Joe, that's great. Where do I sign up? So a couple weeks later, I'm on my way to join Joe's team and start diving into FinOps. So we're going to talk about FinOps here. Maybe. All right. I want to throw a couple of statistics up here on the board. So I think we've all felt the pain of inflation over the last couple of years, right? The price of eggs from pre-2020 to today is significantly different. And cloud costs have been not immune to this. You can see here on the slide, there's been a 3.7% year-over-year increase in cloud costs. That may not seem like a lot, but considering you're paying more for the same level of services, it's an increase, right? The next metric that I show here is kind of impacted by that. So there was a survey that was performed that across 374 respondents across numerous enterprises and organizations, and 66% of them have indicated they have increased the amount that they're spending on cloud resources across AWS, Azure, Google, Oracle, IBM, Tencent, Alibaba, you pick your poison, right, for cloud service provider. Moving on, I've got two other statistics that I want to talk about. The first here is that as of the most recent surveys conducted earlier this year, it's estimated that 27% of all resources in the cloud are wasted. That means underutilized resources, improperly utilized storage, orphaned resources, unconsumed resources. 27% is significant. I don't know about you, but I couldn't waste 27% of my paycheck in today's environment. So why should we do that with our cloud budget? The next statistic here talks about the yearly increase estimated for 2024 in public cloud spending. And that number is $114 billion. I don't know about you, but $114 billion is pretty significant. It brings the total of estimated cloud spend for the year up to $675.4 billion. 27% of that comes to be about $184 billion wasted in cloud spend. Could anyone here use $184 billion? Maybe. Search around the couch a little bit, come up with it. Moving on. So what do we do about it, right? Do we have someone who's a cloud czar, who owns all of the cloud spend for all of these organizations, all of these companies, even within your own enterprises or companies? No, we don't. So we're going to talk through a couple of different personas here and what their specific stake is in cloud investment. So the first one, finance, right? The people who hold the purse strings have a vested interest in how much we're spending. I've put up some sample commentary here from these various stakeholders, or as we call them, personas. Moving on from finance, we talk about leadership, executives, right? I don't know if anyone here has ever been on a call where someone says, why are we spending so much money on IT? What do you even do? What's the purpose of all this money that I'm throwing away into the cloud, right? I've got a couple of other personas here that we're going to talk about. We're going to just move through all of them. We've got procurement. We've got the product owners, right? All of whom have different priorities in the day-to-day. And then the last one here is engineering, right? So who here has been in IT for a while, right? Anyone done any legacy work, data center work, designed applications, developed applications? Have you ever just thrown a buffer on top of what you've estimated, right? You go, oh, it's probably going to take X amount, but let's throw 20% on top, right? Just to cover any higher usage, spikes in volume. Well, that gets costly after a while, right? So moving on, we're going to talk about the FinOps framework, which was established by an organization known as the FinOps Foundation. It's a subset of the Linux Foundation, so it is an open group. It's nonprofit. They're very focused on helping organizations manage their cost and their value in an effective manner. So if we take it to the next slide, we're going to talk about what FinOps is. So FinOps is an operational framework and a cultural practice which maximizes the business value of cloud, enables timely data-driven decision-making, and through collaboration between business, engineering, and finance teams, brings financial accountability. There we go. All right. So in addition to the definition of what FinOps is, there are 6 underlying principles that drive the entirety of the framework and the practice. And the first is that teams need to collaborate, right? We already talked about the fact that there are many different personas with different interests in what you're spending in your cloud today. So all of those people, if they're not talking, cannot make effective decisions that are going to drive value and decrease cost. And the second of these is talking about decisions being driven by the business value. So I talked about a lot of cost metrics up front. But in order for you to be successful as an organization, you have to be able to tie what you're spending to the value that you're deriving, right? So for large-scale enterprises, that may be things like revenue growth, profitability. Other organizations, like in the public sector, may be about citizens served, right? One of my former clients, the Department of Veterans Affairs. How many veterans are serviced by an application or a service, and what benefit are they deriving from it, right? Moving on, we talk about accountability, which is the third one. Everyone takes ownership for their spend in the cloud, right? We don't go lock developers in a dark room where they go and they code and they write applications, they deploy cloud resources, they spin up cloud formation templates, and drive all this cost, right? We want everyone to see what they're spending, how they're spending it, and how it impacts the bottom line, whatever that bottom line may be. Oh, I hit a button here. We're going to take it back. All right. The fifth one here is that a centralized team should drive your FinOps operations. Now, this may vary depending on the scale of your organization, right? A large enterprise like IBM, we likely have dedicated FinOps teams, right, who are managing this across many different organizations and helping manage that cost and value. Smaller organizations, it may be a different hat that someone wears, right? You may do some development, you may do some architecture and engineering, you may also be the FinOps practitioner in your organization, helping to manage these operations. And then the last one is to take advantage of the variable use in the cloud. So variable use, for anyone unfamiliar with cloud, you can spin up or you can spin down resources as you need them, right? It's going to define how you can leverage cost measures to save money, right? So when we talk about variable usage, if someone's not using non-production environments, if someone is not in a development environment, a test environment, anything pre-production, should you have those up on nights, weekends, holidays, right? There are places that you can scale in, scale out, and only consume what you need. Now, the FinOps framework has 4 domains and 22 capabilities here. I'm going to talk through these at a fairly high level, but if anyone has any questions at the end, I'm happy to field them. The first and foremost is understanding cloud usage and cost. So to know where you are as an organization, you have to understand all of that data, right? As I said, I'm a self-proclaimed data junkie. I love data. I like having quantifiable numbers to reference. If you don't know where you are, the rest of this becomes meaningless. So, talking through the capabilities that fall under this domain, we've got things like data ingestion, right? So this means, what are your data sources of truth? Are you pulling things directly from cloud service providers? Are you pulling things from observability platforms? Where is your information coming from, and how are you going to use that effectively to drive a FinOps practice? The second one is allocation. Allocation, which is all about ensuring that that accountability we talked about before is measured, right? You want to make sure that you can trace back spend and all of that data rather than getting a monthly invoice. You can see daily who's driving cost, what it's being consumed for, and ultimately what value it's providing. Then we talk about reporting and analytics, so all of this data has to be useful for something, right? This may be different across an organization than who sees what data, right? You may have a team who's doing application development, who needs to see what they're spending, how the architecture of their application or their workload is generating cost and value. And then at an executive level, you may just want an aggregate roll-up on a monthly basis, weekly basis to report the financial health of the organization when it comes to cloud spend. And then the last one is anomaly management. And anomalies happen, right? I've yet to work in an environment that is completely static and never has any fires that need to be put out. And anomaly management is very focused on capturing that information, putting it in the right hands quickly and effectively so that they can make decisions to remedy it. All right, quantifying business value. So I, again, talked a lot about cost. Here's how we're going to talk about what FinOps does for an organization to drive improvement. So the first that we talk about is planning and estimating. I don't know if anyone here has done cloud migration work before, moving from on-premises in a data center, bare metal servers, maybe even a virtualized environment, into the cloud. But planning and estimating is all about making the right decisions about what resources you're going to need, what compute, what storage, what networking, what virtual private, what VPCs you may need. I'm an AWS guy. What segmented network, et cetera, right? So you want to understand all of these things before you move them into your cloud environment or your landing zone. Forecasting and budgeting, I'm going to talk about, they are distinct, but they go hand in hand, right? Forecasting is all about understanding, based on your historical data, as well as any upcoming planned projects, new initiatives that you may be taking, and how that's going to impact what you're spending. And then budgeting for them effectively, and ensuring that teams are held accountable by sticking to those budgets. So it's not just establishing a dollar amount, a threshold for teams and what they're going to spend, but holding them accountable for it over the course of your performance, weekly, monthly, quarterly, yearly, whatever makes sense for your organization. Benchmarking is all about identifying where you're at, moving forward, and identifying how you improve. So you establish key performance indicators, you establish metrics, you identify information that allows you to say, are we doing better than yesterday? And then unit economics, which is a tough one for a lot of people to properly define, because this is a victim of data quality, which we talked about briefly in data ingestion. So there is an IBM programmer from the 60s, George Fuchsel, who was coined with first putting in print the phrase garbage in, garbage out. For anyone unfamiliar with this, if you do not have quality data, you're not going to be able to make meaningful decisions based off of that data. And unit economics is heavily driven by this, in that you're taking all of that costing data that you've identified and any value metrics that you as an organization hold as important and tying them together. It's allowing you to talk apples to apples in your investment decisions, right? Simple early examples may be things like, how do I measure how much I'm spending per VM for compute, per gigabyte of storage in the cloud, right? Those are very cost-centered metrics, but you might want to be able to expand that over the course of your FinOps practice to say, what am I paying per user of this application? What am I paying for each new visitor to my website? How much am I paying for each existing user of my website? How am I measuring myself with data to identify how I'm performing? We'll move on. All right, now we're going to talk about optimizing. So one of the major facets here, and we'll talk about this extensively in the upcoming slides, is optimization of your cloud usage, right? There's a couple of different ways to handle that. There's architecting for cloud, which is understanding which cloud services you have available to you, right? Anyone who has done old data center work understands I have a server, I have my limited compute and memory and storage, and it's all networked together. It's running in a dark room that's temperature and humidity controlled. But how do you optimize something like that, right? So architecting for cloud is understanding, can I do this better? Can I do this differently? Can I use a managed service instead of patching VMs, doing backups, providing snapshots, right? Can I mitigate my costs as well as potentially some risks by leveraging these things that the cloud service providers do already, right? Can I solve this by writing code on a Lambda function that would otherwise be hosted in a VM with dedicated compute, right? Now we talk about workload optimization. So I've talked about workloads before. I talked about waste very early on. Waste is something that we target with workload optimization, right? Are you only using 50% of the capacity that you're paying for in a virtual machine? Are you using 10% of the storage that you should be using? Are you consuming too much storage because you're storing old snapshots or data backups? Should they be moved to a different cloud storage tier, right? S3 Glacier on AWS. So these are all areas where you can optimize your workload using the native cloud features for lower cost. Licensing and SaaS, so SaaS is software as a service. This is all about making informed decisions around how you're consuming services from other companies, right? So you have independent software vendors, or ISVs as we call them, that are providing you things like ServiceNow for ITSM, IT Service Management, right? Do you want to purchase that as a subscription-based instance? Do you want to be able to deploy services locally? Do you want to be able to buy a license directly from someone like Oracle for Adobe and bring those licenses into your environment yourself? Do you want perpetual licenses? Do you want yearly subscriptions? What makes the most sense for what your organization is consuming and the right price point? Now we talk about rate optimization, and this is the other side of the cost optimization coin that I talk about with workload optimization. This is all about understanding where you've got static resources in your environment, things like VMs that you have running 24/7, the capacity never changes, or you may have other portions of your environment that are very stable. And this is about, can I then take that and come up with a new pricing scheme? And a lot of the cloud service providers have things known as committed use, things like reserved instances, savings plans. If you know you're going to be consuming enough of one resource, you can optimize that rate by paying up front in 1 year or 3 year batches to improve your rate. You can save up to 67% on compute in AWS if you pay for 3 years of service on an EC2 instance up front. And 60% of savings is pretty significant if you're talking about something you know is never going to change. And then the last one that we talk about here is actually a relatively recent addition to the FinOps framework, which is cloud sustainability. So we all talk about environmental impact nowadays, right? And even if you're not operating your own data centers, if you're not operating your own computers and servers, you still have environmental impact, right? These large-scale data centers that are run by your cloud service providers are generating CO2 output, right? There are emissions to be concerned with. They're defined as scope 3 in your reporting, if there's any ESG junkies out there. But these are all things that we have to examine, right? Does it make sense to use a data center or a region within AWS here or here based on the power that's being supplied on renewable energy, solar, wind, or is it a coal-based power plant that supplies it, right? We'll move on. We'll talk about managing the FinOps practice here. So FinOps as a practice has a lot that goes into it, right? We've talked about a lot of the domains and capabilities. And there's an entire domain here that is all about managing this internally. So the first one is FinOps practice operations. And this is where you talk about the actual establishment within your organization of who is going to run FinOps, who is going to be accountable for driving that team, for championing those changes, for driving adoption of FinOps practices at all levels of the organization that are consuming cloud. And so there's a couple of main features to this. You have to design the organization. You have to have the right stakeholders. We showed personas earlier. And then you've got to identify who is going to be the champion, right? If you try to make this change and you're an application developer, right, on a team of 16 people, you're probably not going to have much clout. But if you can get the right champions to drive the change within your organization, establish a cloud center of excellence, someone who's going to have the authority, CIO, CFO, to drive that change for you, it's going to help this be far more successful. FinOps education and enablement. So I'm sitting here talking to you about FinOps today, right? It's a novel concept for a lot of you. But if your organization is operating at a comprehensive level where you're all speaking the same language, it makes every conversation you have about value and cost so much easier because you're all speaking the same language, you're using the same terms. Moving on, we talk about cloud policy and governance, which is how are you going to effectively manage this organization? Are you going to have a tagging strategy that supports your cost allocation? Are you going to have repercussions for teams that are going over their budgets? Are you going to have internal competitions that are going to drive improvement between different teams by seeing who can be the most efficient week over week, month over month? Invoicing and chargeback, so everybody gets their cloud bill on a monthly basis from every cloud service provider. What's the importance of that data, right? If you're effectively allocating, if you're effectively tracking that back to teams, you can enable something known as chargeback. And chargeback means that no longer is IT just a black bucket that money gets thrown at to host things. All of this gets traced back to the product teams, applications, workloads that are generating the cost to come out of those project budgets. Anyone who is in IT knows that's a great thing because it means that people are going to make smarter, more responsible decisions about their consumption. FinOps assessment was a relatively recent addition as a capability. And this is all about understanding where you are as an organization, what your priorities are in terms of what's most important for a FinOps practice, and how you're going to get there. So this identifies what's important to you, where you want to mature. I'll talk about maturity here in the lower right-hand corner in a little bit. But it's all about knowing where you're at and continuously improving. And then onboarding workloads, this is about bringing new workloads either into a cloud environment or moving between cloud environments. So onboarding workloads is important. You've got to understand where you're going to deploy things. Does it make fiscal sense? Does it make sustainable sense? Is it the right decision for your organization? It's all about mapping and modeling and knowing where you're going to be. We talk about FinOps tools and services. IBM, other companies out there provide services and tools that can equip you in terms of platforms, automation, capabilities that may help you if there's a right ROI for your organization. And then intersecting disciplines, which I'll talk about a little bit here in a moment when I talk about personas. We're going to come back down to the personas now and move into the lower left-hand corner. So I talked about all of these before, but you'll notice there's 6 as opposed to 5. So I showed these on one of the early slides. The FinOps practitioner is the 6th spoke on this wheel, right? So this is going to be important that you have all of the right stakeholders engaged for driving your FinOps practice and for making the investment decisions in your cloud spend. And so there we go, hey. Move on, I now talk about allied personas. So I talked about earlier, I'm from an IT service management background. So you'll see ITSM, ITAM, which is IT asset management, IT financial management, which encompasses more than just cloud. That's things like technology, business management, address, as well as sustainability and security, right? So all of these have components that may impact your cost and your consumption of cloud resources, right? And now we'll move over to maturity. So I briefly touched on maturity earlier when I talked about assessments. Maturity is iterative. FinOps Foundation likes to break this down to crawl, walk, and run. And it's not a wholesale description of your FinOps practice, right? You may have things that are more important for your organization. Early on, you may want to focus very heavily on workload optimization, right? You want to achieve those quick wins that are going to drive cost avoidance and dollar savings early on. So you may focus on that and drive maturity in that particular capability and not worry so much about other capabilities like rate optimization until a later point in time. So one thing I want everyone to internalize is that FinOps is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And you're going to improve over time by focusing on what's most important for you and your company and organization. And we're going to come back to the whole FinOps framework. But now, this is where some intrepid audience member goes, what about the phases that you didn't talk about, Andy? Well, okay, let's talk about the phases. The FinOps framework has 3 primary phases, which are inform, optimize, and operate. And I'm going to use this to drive the rest of the conversation today. So, let's talk inform. I've talked about various components of the inform phase already, and I'm just going to briefly rehash them and we'll move on so as to not bore you any further. Identifying your data sources of truth, identifying what value is to your company or organization, allocating your costs effectively to those people who are driving costs within your organization, defining your reporting, and then identifying the key performance indicators of how you're going to measure your success in deploying FinOps. The optimize phase talks about how you actually can improve your cost to value ratios. So it talks about optimizing your workload, where you can automate things, right? Are you leveraging auto-scaling capabilities? Do you have tools that will allow you to scale things in, out, shut resources down when you're not consuming them? Are you architecting for cloud? Are you utilizing new services that are come out with every year by these cloud service providers? And then, are you ready and able to start optimizing your rates? All right. Now, we talk about the operate phase. We talked about establishing governance, establishing policy, identifying how you're going to run your organization. This is where you actually implement monitoring, right? Is this going to be with popsicle sticks and glue? Is it going to be Excel workbooks? Are you going to have a dedicated tool that handles these pieces? And then how are you educating and training your staff and your workforce so that everybody's talking that common language? Are you automating policies so that you don't have to have someone go in and manually pull reports to get optimization recommendations in the hands of engineers? And then lastly, continuously improve, right? I can't say this enough. It's iterative. You're going to start, you're going to stumble, you're going to walk, then you're going to run. So we're going to dive into these phases a little bit more here and how they impact you if you're looking to stand up a FinOps operation within your organization. So we're going to break this down into the inform phase for the first part. And the first most important piece is, what's your cloud strategy? So are you mono-cloud? Are you multi-cloud? Are you hybrid cloud, right? Are you consuming resources from multiple service providers? Are you still hosting some of your own data, right? These are all very important in what your strategies may be going forward for deploying FinOps. What are your data sources of truth? I keep going over this particular piece because it's very, very important. You need quality data or your organization will fail. Are you going to pull that from CSV billing files? I don't know if anybody in here has ever opened a CUR file, a cost and usage report from AWS. But if you have a sizable organization, they are very large, they're very intimidating, and they can have millions of rows of data. Are you going to use an observability platform? I have Datadog and Stana, Splunk, a couple of big names out there. You can use this to enrich your data, give you more meaningful insight into how you're consuming your cloud resources, what's being done from a performance perspective. And then finally, do you have a dedicated FinOps tool, right? I'm an IBMer. Aptio is a recent acquisition we made last year that is solely focused on getting FinOps data into the hands of everyone in an organization who touches cloud spend. And then the other pieces, what's your business value, right? By deploying a FinOps organization, you're going to improve your budgeting. You're going to improve your forecasting accuracy. It's going to take less human capital to do these things if you've established the rigor around them. You're going to be able to effectively benchmark yourself, both internally and externally, right? Are we doing better than we did yesterday? Are specific teams or application or product owners performing better than others? What can we learn from them to drive that same sort of practice elsewhere in the organization? And finally, how are you performing against organizations external to your own who may have similar missions, objectives, and goals? And then unit economics, which I talked about extensively earlier, so I won't talk about that further. And then again, cost allocation, very, very important in informing who is spending what where. So how do you begin optimizing if you've already looked at the informed phase? So first, we're going to talk about workload optimization. I talked about this briefly earlier. This is right sizing of your resources, making sure you're using the right compute, storage, the right services to make sure you're not overspending in the cloud. Are you using resource scheduling, which means shutting down those resources when they're not being consumed? What are your cost drivers? Are there other things that you're not examining? Is there labor that's going into managing your cloud resources? Are there license costs that you need to be aware of that you're consuming that are treated as part of your cloud spend? And then identify what you can do to automate those things. So a lot of the cloud service providers today have automation capabilities that you can consume, that you can use to enforce some of these, right? You can scale in, you can scale out, you can scale up, you can scale down, right, as right sizing options. But you also have the ability to spin those resources down and set them on a schedule. You have the ability to automate your reporting. Is that daily? Are there on-demand dashboards with near real-time data that people can consume to make informed decisions about what they're doing today? And then anomaly detection. I talked about this earlier, right? It's not good when at the end of the month you see your cloud bill has doubled because you had some anomalous usage that spiked up your spending by 5 or 10x, right? And the earlier you detect these and get them in the hands of the people who can manage them, who can change them, the less impact that's going to have on your organization, and it becomes a blip instead of a major road bump, right? Architecting for cloud, I've talked about a couple of times here, right? Is there a better way to deliver the services you're doing today? Should you perform an assessment, identify if you should refactor, rehost, replatform, and move your cloud workloads in a different way, deliver it in a different way, or move it somewhere else? And then we talk about evaluating rate optimization. So this is the committed use levers that we talked about earlier: reserved instances, savings plans, committed use discounts. And I wanted to show this graphic. And my colleagues who are here in the room today will recognize this graphic, and I love this graphic. This is real data from an IBM customer, right? This is real information about cloud spending that was going on in 2022. And as you can see, it was moving up at an exponential rate. You see a pronounced curve before they started implementing FinOps practices. Now, the first thing that we did for this company was to focus on the quick wins: right sizing, right tier, budgeting, and then monitoring those workloads. And you can see almost overnight, over the course of 3 days, that cloud spend dropped by almost 75%. That's that purple bar right there, where those were the only activities from a FinOps perspective that were being performed and the impact that it had. The green bar, you'll see it starts to take on a sawtooth pattern, right? You can see the cloud usage grows a little bit, but there are periods where it's shut down, where they're not consuming resources and they're saving money on weekends, on holidays, overnight. Because cloud spend is going to continue to grow. We talked about inflation earlier. And as your organizations or companies grow their services, your cloud spend is going to grow. Growth is not bad as long as it's controlled, as long as it's intentional, as long as it has meaningful value. We're going to talk about the operate phase. So, first and foremost, we're going to talk about establishing your governance and policy. So this is a different view of the personas that I showed you earlier, right? These are the people who are going to be important. Everyone in green should be a core member of your FinOps practice. And everyone in gray is an intersecting or allied persona who have interests that are going to be related to your IT financial management. So first steps: identify all your stakeholders. Identify who's going to champion and drive adoption within your organization. And then create the practice. And know that you're not going to get it perfect the first time. You're going to iterate, you're going to improve. There will be stumbles along the way. And educate and train. I've talked about education and training on 3 separate slides now. It's very important that everyone speaks the same language. FinOps tools and services. I come from IBM. Again, we like our tools, we like our platform, we like our services. Does it make sense for you to bring in experts from external to your organization? Does it make sense to use a platform? Does it make sense to use native cloud service provider tools? These are all the things that you'll evaluate in establishing your own practice. Showback and chargeback. Showback is the step before chargeback that I talked about earlier, about charging the cost back to the generators or originators of that cost. Showback is the first step where you identify and allocate and show that meaningful data to the organization. Automate your policy, right? The less things that you have to do hands on keyboard, the better you're going to be. It's going to mitigate risk for you as long as you're thoughtful and purposeful in implementation. And then communicate early and often. As we talked about earlier, this is a collaborative practice. Everyone needs to be engaged in talking with one another. You can't have silos. Silos lead to what's known as shadow IT, which means someone is spending money that you don't know about, and that's bad. And then the last one is continuously improve. You will get better over time. As you embrace and deliver FinOps, you'll learn what pitfalls there are, where you can improve, if you were off base on any of your priorities, and how you want to move forward. All right, so we didn't cover generative AI yet in the main session, but I know one is coming up from Dr. Joe. Generative AI, of course, is the big buzzword in tech today, right? Artificial intelligence, what it can do for me. Will it solve all of my problems? It might someday, but there are some things that you need to think about as an organization before you decide to employ it. And so from a FinOps perspective, I wanted to highlight some of those. First, what is your baseline today? What is your company or organization doing? And what is the benefit of AI going to be for you that you're expecting? Create your benchmarks and key performance indicators that you're going to use to measure the success of your AI implementations. What value is it going to bring your organization? Create an allocation strategy. So there's two primary ways you can consume generative AI today, just AI as a service or hosting models yourself, which both have their own cons and pros. And then determine what your funding model is. So a lot of the organizations I work with for the federal government today have investment funding, working capital funds, innovation funds that are driving their AI adoption. Is that going to be the case for your business or organization? Maybe yes, maybe no, maybe it's going to be funded by individual product teams. And we'll talk about how to optimize. So AI as a service, you'll see there's a lot of bullets here. I'm not going to go through all of them. AI as a service are things like ChatGPT, like Microsoft Copilot, Google Gemini, things that are managed by a service provider that you're going to have a pricing structure that's going to be completely foreign to everything else. It may be based on token consumption. It's very complex, and you need to know what the inputs and levers are going to be before you start consuming it. For a hosted infrastructure, AI is very compute intensive. I think everyone here in the room is probably familiar with, at a base level, cryptocurrency, Bitcoin mining, those sorts of things, right? Those are GPU-intensive workloads. GPUs are really expensive and intensive to run from an energy perspective and have significant cost and sustainability implications. What's the complexity of your model, right? As models are trained and travel through epochs, which are training periods, they become what we call heavier. They have a larger weight and complexity, and they also increase cost. ChatGPT 3 to 3.5 to 4 all have significantly different cost structures as a result. And then model proliferation, which we effectively refer to as the herd of llamas, which means every time that a model that's foundational is trained or fine-tuned, it effectively becomes a new model. So there may be something out there as you progress and use Gen AI that becomes better for you or worse for you over time. And now we're going to talk about operate, and we're just about done here. So ensure that you have people who understand the technology that you're going to deploy. This may sound pretty straightforward, but the number of times I've heard C-suite executives talk about AI solving all their problems without understanding what goes into it is uncountable. So you have to be responsible stewards in using this technology to ensure it's going to be effective for your organization. It won't open you up to risk or additional cost. And there we go. Again, educate and train. So IBM did this huge challenge around our AI model, Watson X. We've done it twice now over the last 2 years, where every practitioner within the organization is invited to participate and get hands-on with generative AI. It really teaches you a lot about some of the pitfalls, what things it does well and what things it doesn't. And then automation, right? So we talked about this earlier. scale in, scale up, scale down, right? You don't want to be running costly GPUs for a Gen AI instance that's sitting there and doing nothing for your organization. And then lastly, continue to refine your use case, right? Generative AI is also going to be iterative. You need to figure out what it means for you today, what it's going to mean for you tomorrow, and what your roadmap is to complete adoption of the product or service. And then this last actual slide I'm going to show you is just a little bit about IBM and why I am up here today talking to you about it, and why we have a unique perspective on FinOps, technology business management, and even generative AI. I won't leave this one up too much longer, but I can move on to the question slide. If anyone has anything that they want me to dive deeper into, we have a couple of minutes here. And if not, I just want to thank you for sitting through my diatribe today.
Yeah, we still have a few more minutes. Does anyone have any questions for Andy? There's got to be at least one out there. All right, well, I have one. Maybe a challenging one to answer. So, how do you keep up with everything, right? So even if you're just, your organization is AWS, single, CSP, it is just constantly changing the technology that they have, the pricing that they have, the new technology that could lead to lower expense, right? So any recommendations on how you just keep up with all of that in order to apply the principles that you're sharing today?
Yeah, I mean, it is tricky, right? So the obvious answer, and I'll say this tongue-in-cheek, is have a FinOps practice, right? But alternative to that, right, you're going to have experts who are consuming these services on a day-to-day basis, right? Your architects, your engineers, the people who are developing and managing those workloads in the cloud. They're your experts, right? You want to rely on them. And you also want to make sure that you're not working them to the bone, right? They have the ability to monitor emerging technologies, right? To attend conferences, AWS has reInvent, where they take over Las Vegas for a week, right? Things like that, where you can see the new keynotes and technologies that are being announced. Pricing's a little trickier, and that actually requires you to stay on top of your historical data that comes from your cloud service provider. So if you start monitoring what you've spent in AWS and Azure and Google and OCI, you can actually see trends, right? You can see changes to the costs of specific processor types, specific compute, specific VMs, specific services, and you can chart those trends over time. And if you're lucky enough to have a large organization, you also have technical account managers who you can engage with specific questions to dive in on their end, because they don't always know. I heard an anecdote recently about a team at Azure with Microsoft who was asked about some pricing changes, and they had zero clue at the front level of what drove it. They ended up having to reach back in the organization. Fine.
Andy, good job.
Thanks, Joe.
Assuming we have federal government clients in the audience, can you talk about how close we are to satisfying the security governance required around the data associated with cloud, specifically FedRAMP compliancy for the tools that we use? And as a bonus, this is a surprise question, is there an agency you can think of that is most mature in their implementation of FinOps today who could serve as a benchmark for the others?
Okay. So for the first part, talking around federal government computing requirements. So anyone out here is maybe familiar with NIST, right? The National Institute of Standards and Technology. They essentially have a set of guidelines which govern how all federal systems and applications have to be managed from a security perspective. And they've codified those for cloud service providers into a program called FedRAMP, which is a risk authorization program where you may take services, tools, technology through to allow federal government clients to essentially go in, select them off the shelf, and consume them. And so there's a lot of different security protocols and things that have to be managed from that perspective in order for a government client to be able to use any of these tools. So that's what Joe was getting at with the FedRAMP components. We at IBM, we have Apptio Cloudability, which is our premier FinOps tool, which is FedRAMP moderate authorized at DISA Impact Level 2, which is the DoD's own set of security controls. And then for the second question around organizations that have matured in FinOps, the Office of Personnel Management, Melvin Brown II is a deputy CIO out there, has been a huge champion in the government for the last several years. Department of Energy, GSA, all have robust FinOps practices as well. And in fact, we're part of a team of 4 organizations that went out and wrote the initial playbook for federal government on how to deploy these with their security. And Autumn, you just grab that crook when you need to, yank me off the stage. Get a little bit of music going on, tap dance.
As someone who's going through and getting my AWS certifications and things like that, what are the things that I should be looking out for to implement things like this into my knowledge base, my workflow? Is there something, I guess, to put it into a question, if there's one thing you now could go back and tell you starting, look out for this, this is really important, what would that one thing be?
Ooh, okay. For me, I think the biggest struggle, I'll handle this in 2 different facets. The first being the biggest struggle for employing FinOps for me is always organizational change. Getting people on board and willing to make that jump into deploying the practice. For me, that's always the hardest thing. Now, that's not going to cover, what you're getting into from a technical perspective for AWS, but that is absolutely the hardest part. Getting people to adopt and change. People are naturally resistant to any change. They want to keep going with what they're comfortable with. It's always hard getting into the unknown. And then from a technical perspective, for FinOps specifically, if you're focusing on an AWS certification, one of the pillars of the well-architected framework now is cost, right? There's a whole bunch of good information under that section of any of the study guides or educational materials you may be perusing, which talk about AWS specifically around cost management. They've actually improved their services leaps and bounds over the last 5 years, and what you can see in console on AWS today. 5 years ago, it was a wasteland, right? You had to pull those curve files out and manually parse the data. Nowadays, you can actually set CloudWatch to monitor utilization data, which you can then marry to your cost data, all within the AWS ecosystem if you're monocloud. Now, if you're multi-cloud, like we talked about earlier, it gets a lot more complex because you're unifying and integrating different systems. And that's where tooling and platforming really shines from third parties.
Any other questions? Maybe last one, I think.
Hey, thanks for the presentation. Just a quick question about the playbook. Is it on the .org site you showed, U.S. Public Sector Playbook?
Yes, it is. So
Okay.
they actually have a work group. It was previously headed by Melvin Brown, who I mentioned earlier. It's all available on FinOps.org. So you go on there. If you search Public Sector Playbook, it'll pop right up for you. The working group does periodic revisions to it, so there is an organization that still does it. Because I am with a vendor organization in a sales role, I'm not allowed to participate, but they've got a lot of good folks working today.
All right. I just have a quick question for the audience. Are there any high school or college students in here still? Okay. All right. So I just wanted to say this presentation has been pretty exciting, I think, for me, and just wanted to share maybe for those of you who haven't quite entered the workforce yet, the ability to go into an organization and optimize costs and ultimately reduce expense is amazing. You want finance to be your best friend, and there's really no better way for the CFO or the finance department to be your best friend than to come in there and show how you can optimize cloud costs, because they can really get out of control. So, Andy, thank you so much for this presentation, and just really exciting kind of new territory, if you will, that is maybe not getting quite the focus it needs to in certain organizations, but certainly take this back and really look at what you're doing in your organizations, and for you students out there, really something to kind of think about, and you can really build a really solid career out of, I think. So.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.